the first seminar of the Balliol Interdisciplinary Institute funded project, which I think we're probably calling Exploring Theme Parks, Interdisciplinary Academic Study of Theme Parks and Immersive Spaces. I started this, I put in a proposal to the Balliol Interdisciplinary Institute thinking that really nobody would ever fund a Mickey Mouse Studies project for a million years, particularly in Oxford. And I'm delighted to say that they have funded it, and I'm even more delighted that we have attracted some professors from around the world who, particularly Scott, have specialised in this and have pushed what is, we accept a niche field, forward a great deal. So, delighted to introduce Scott Lukas. He wrote the first book I ever read on theme parks, Sociology, and the second book as well.
Okay.
So it's all your fault that I ever believed that this could be an academic discussion.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much, Charlotte, for organizing and for all of you coming today. And this is actually part of my European theme park tour. I just returned from 3 days in Germersheim, which is an hour and a half away from Frankfurt. And we have a year-long project there on theme parks funded by the German government. And so it was the second meeting. And we're producing a book. I think the tentative title is Critical Studies in Theme Parks or something like this. It's basically an interdisciplinary book, so it's continuing the focus that you have here. And each of the chapters will be a key area of theme park studies, ranging from the historical aspects, we were talking about Blackpool Pleasure Beach, to rides and attractions, to even the effect of theme parks on the rest of the world. So it's just such a pleasure coming to Europe because there is so much more interest than in the States, ironically enough. We have cultural studies and American studies, but often I think theme parks are, maybe as you're saying, not seen as a subject of proper academic research or the work that's done on them, and I'll try to fight against some of that today with some of the tendencies I'll be focusing on. The work often done in theme parks can be, I don't want to say superficial, but sometimes you start with some model of Disney, and I'll get to this in a second in a slide, and you connect that to the ills of consumer society. And there's certainly room for this sort of work. But hopefully I'll move beyond that today. So I'll just give you a bit of my background, and the handouts here, I framed this around Imaginaries, and so that we'll follow this around. And then the back here has reference materials. So you'll see at the bottom left corner a number, and that's just a citation, so you're certainly welcome to, most of these are downloadable online. And my information is up here, my YouTube site, which I'll refer to. I have a pretty extensive theme park bibliography I've been compiling. You're welcome to actually be a part of that if you like. It's a Google Doc so we can collaborate. Really, for me, a lot of this is about collaboration and building networks of like-minded people who have interests in the academic study of theme parks or even the design side, which I'll talk about. And then just my business card, that just has some of the main texts I've written on there, and my contact if you need that. Yeah, so my background. So I am a cultural anthropologist by training. I did my dissertation at Rice University in the late 90s, and I was mentioning earlier that at that time, a lot of the work I was doing was on postmodern methodology. And my dissertation actually was, I was working at this very theme park. It's since closed. This is actually a brochure from 1968, which was the first year the park opened, and it was one of those things I found on eBay. And so I was a park trainer at Astroworld, and then that became the subject of my dissertation. Now, as I talk about the evolution of my work today, I'll mention the fact that when I was looking at the theme park in the 90s, my interest was more in the general dynamics of the service industry. So managerial relationships, issues of the guest, all the sorts of things you'd read about in organizational theory. So it wasn't necessarily getting into what I do now, which is more the design side, and then also what I call the conceptual or even the existential side of the theme park. This is one of our handbooks. Every year there was a yearbook produced, and this was an actual activity. So I was a training coordinator. There were about 5 or 6 of us during a season, and we were the ones then who would train employees. And this all happened because I was at Rice doing my dissertation, and I saw just a brochure on the campus, just like you see here today. I was walking in town, and it said, "Would you like a great job?" And it was actually an ad for a bar. I guess they wanted someone to become a bartender. So I was walking from the train station, but it was sort of like that. It just said, job opportunity. I think it paid $6 an hour, which was just, I think, $1 over minimum wage at the time. But it was a fascinating experience. And so what became a job then actually became the subject of my dissertation. This particular slide here, actually, you see they have blindfolds on, and there was a group that was brought in, and they did these trainings, and one of the things which I think had to violate all the OSHA, the safety laws and everything, was letting people get on and off the rides in blindfolds. And the theory was that you would be these were all managers of the various rides. This was called the wagon wheel. This was in our Western themed area. So it was just a big troika spinning ride. And the activity here was focused on trust, and there were a lot of interesting rituals I wrote about in my dissertation about how you became a better rides leader or grounds quality leader if you did the cleanliness and the hygiene stuff. So that's my background as far as schooling. Now, since that time, I've shifted a bit, and I'll talk about this today, into more of the design side of things, including working collaboratively with folks in the theme park industry. Quite a few years ago, I led a 2-day seminar for Walt Disney Imagineering, and I can't talk about that work today because of non-disclosure agreements, which those of you, if you get into this world, if you do any kind of corporate consulting or work for designers or theme park companies, often you're bound by these NDAs or non-disclosure agreements that are pretty common in the social science folks who do work in the corporate arena. And those of you in the legal side of things, you understand this, why this is so important. But it's also stifling for those of us who wish to write about some of that work. So, since the time I've looked at the theme park as an academic object, I've begun to do more of this collaborative work, including the Germany group, which I mentioned. And Germany seems to be a hotbed for this. There's 4 different projects I've been involved with in Germany, different parts of Germany, different groups of people that focus on either theme parks, or one of them, the earliest one, was focused on historical reenactment, which I find is a little lacking actually in theme park studies, because when you get into historical reenactment, you often get into some of the domains of theming and performance that are important ones for the theme park. And I was just going to say, yesterday I was talking to Charlotte about this, but I had a chance to visit KidZania at Westfield, London, which is a miniature, it's very much like a theme park. It's for little kids, and it's fascinating. I took a tour there, and that was quite wonderful. And then the other project I'm working on, the other hat I wear is I do work in gender studies. I have a website called the Gender Ads Project, which I think is on my card. And I met a woman there who's starting a project that will be another one of these collaboratives. And so any of you interested in this, please let me know and we can sign you up. But she's doing a company called Women Friendly Fashion. And she's already had contacts with the mayor's office in London. And she's hoping to create a collaborative group across disciplines, across industries, that will focus on positive body image, gender equality, LGBTQ issues in the world of fashion. So it's another hat that I wear, and it actually at some level ties in with some of this work as I'm talking about images, because my Gender Ads project is essentially a database of 3,000 or so, or maybe it's closer to 4,000 images of advertising. And you can probably imagine that most of those images are fairly negative, right? These are the bad examples of what is there in the world of advertising. So it kind of keeps with the theme of imaginaries or images. So this particular progression, I would say, is, initially I was interested in the theme park as a subject of service industry culture, and now my interests are more in the design aspects, and particularly in imagining collaborative opportunities to connect academics and practitioners. And I'll talk about some of that work I've done a bit later. And I think if we begin, I mentioned this earlier, but if we began this discussion of theme parks, I think a lot of times it is used as an example. So if you imagine I just Googled consumer society and those things come up. It's sort of seen like a subset or an example of or a symptom or something like this. The word is hard to find, but it's a reflection of what's wrong with consumer society. The hegemony, the power dynamics, the sense of conformity that is created when you go to a theme park and you experience things. The fact that you have to be a consumer. And I'll end the talk today talking about, can we imagine a world in which the theme park exists not as a site of consumption, but as a site of politics or critical reflection or even civics. And so if that strikes you a little odd, it's intentional because I'm trying to shift the conversation here. In fact, I find, at least with academics from the States, that there are a few out there, and I won't mention them, particularly if this video goes public, but they often they write a book on theme parks. But that's the only connection they have to the theme park. So it becomes a case study among many. And I think it's kind of interesting. There aren't a lot of people that started the way I did, which is writing my dissertation, doing most of my research, again, with the exception of the gender stuff, which is a separate project. But that essentially has been the theme of my research going back into the 90s. So I think that's rare, at least in the States. I don't know what I'd say in Europe, but so this is where my interests are taking me now. Again, the design context, even talking about the pleasures of the guest, the person who comes to the theme park, and then imagining collaborative forms of research, postmodern research, so-called meso or middle-level research that maybe tries to imagine not how the guest sees the theme park nor the academic, but somewhere in the middle. If you look at one of my advisors, Stephen Tyler, an anthropologist, he wrote a lot about the middle voice, and it's the imagination. If you think of the direct voice, subject, verb, object, the middle voice is one in which the actor is not taking action on an object, but is part of the action happening. So it's a kind of a conceptual, philosophical way of maybe asking, how can we imagine seeing the object that we're studying in new senses? So I thought I'd begin with this as one of those symptoms I talked about, a critique, and this is how the theme park is imagined. We were talking about whether Canada's Wonderland is themed or Blackpool Pleasure Beach. Often if you go to a theme park, there's a set of distinct theme lands that are part of the theme park, and they could be based on a variety of characteristics, which I'll get to later. So this is, as you might imagine, we saw the Bridge of Sighs in town here, so it's very timely. I don't know if it's pictured here, but this is the Venetian in Las Vegas, and so this is common if you're reading a book about consumer culture, whether it's the French post-structuralist guys, Baudrillard, Eco, and others, they would often use Las Vegas or Disneyland as an example, again, of the ills of consumer society, of hyper-reality, of simulation. And indeed, I think it's a good place to start because as objects or images, it's a good place to begin our analysis. And the new reader I just released, which is public domain, you can download the entire thing. It's, I think, interesting project in that it is freely available to the public. This is from the introduction, so I just mentioned a couple tables here, how theme park designers generally consider creating a theme land or some sort of themed attraction. You could use modes of architecture, material culture, the narrative, which is the text or the backstory that guides the individual interacting in the theme lands and so forth. And then you can think about the source materials of theming. So it could be a time period. We were talking about, many of us have been to Universal Studios Singapore. So the Egypt theme land is very distinctive there. So that has a particular time period as well as, you could say, culture. So these can overlap. There could be a brand. If you ever go to Munich, BMW World is a great example of a branded space. KidZania, I think, combines a lot of these. You could certainly, though, involve any number of approaches to create what we call a theme space. These next slides, I found these at of all things, in Los Angeles at the farmer's market there, which is kind of famous. They have a sticker store. I don't know why. I guess young people like stickers too. I don't know if they're scrapbooking, if they put them on their Moleskinas or what, but I found this to be a great representation of some of the issues we'll be getting into today. And you can see, I'll zoom in here, These are representations of New York City, and we have Alaska. Oh, and we have London here. You see Mexico. And so, it's kind of silly looking at this because on the one hand, it's just something maybe for kids or for tourists to purchase and to have a representation. But maybe the question for us today is, are these signs or symbols or key essences of cultures or places or people, are they accurate? If they are not accurate, how do we combat, and this is the culture anthropologist in me, how do we combat stereotyping and essentialism and ideas about culture that assume that people or places are a certain way? And indeed, these words, essentialism, if I often use in gender studies, but if I say that this is the essence of American society, and I then try to encapsulate that in a design scheme in a theme park, is that a problematic move? Is that problematic to do that? Symbolism, shorthand, imitation, stereotyping, right? And maybe you could say these are different degrees of the same issue or the same problem. This is a chart I often use that, going back to the example of the Venetian, and I would use here, if you've read any, I don't know if you've read a lot of existentialist philosophy, Kafka or Heidegger, but they often talk about the idea that our reality, our being, our consciousness is made up of undifferentiated bits and pieces, and all the ideas we have in our head at any given time, all the things we see. And it's very hard, existentially at any one point to sort of locate and say, this is the essence of our being. Well, I think it's the same, if you will, metaphor conceptually to think about. If I say I'm going to visit Venice, and I would say Venice, and I was arguing with some in the Germany seminar about this, because they were sort of suggesting like there's an authentic Paris, and Paris Disneyland is inauthentic. And of course, if you go to Paris or you go to London or Oxford, where today I heard some Americans talking about Harry Potter, and they weren't referring to the place name of wherever it was, but they were referring to what it was in the movies, right? So there's this sense that authenticity is always evading us. We can never determine what's authentic. But let's say for a moment we can determine that there's a place called Venice. Again, what point in time of Venice? But there's a city there. We could say, just like the existentialists would speak of our being, it's represented by undifferentiated and connected multiplicities. Every symbol, every action, every event, every thought anyone has while they're in Venice, all the representations outside of Venice, somehow the designer then will remake that. And so in the example of the Venetian Las Vegas, I might take some of the key moments that are, again, to go back to our stickers, very indicative of maybe what the belief is that a tourist would appreciate if they visit a themed casino. So those become the points. And of course, we're missing all the other points. And that tends to be, I think, one of the challenges in studying this, is because when a cultural theorist looks at this, they say, well, if you go to the Venetian in Las Vegas, it's inherently fake. And I guess on the one hand I would say, yes, that's true, right? There's a struggle there maybe to understand if that place is truly authentic, but then so is Venice, or so is Paris, or London, or Oxford, right? Like, at any moment in time, can you really say if something is authentic or not? So it is a challenge. This is not a published piece, but you can download it on my academia site. And I call this culture sampling. And I suggest in it that this actually goes back well before the time of theme parks. It happens in the Grand Tour tradition. It happens in the world of art with Gauguin and Picasso, right? Going around and sampling world cultures in their sketchbook, drawing something of a dance or a ritual, indigenous practice, and then that becomes part of their art. And I call it culture sampling to suggest that much like a DJ or a hip-hop artist takes bits and pieces or breaks of music and combines those in a new form, it's a similar process that's going on architecturally, performatively, materially, and emotionally, even linguistically, in theme park spaces or theme spaces. And this particular sign, I call this my favorite sign in Las Vegas. It's right as you enter the Paris, and it says, "Caution, the cobblestone floor you're about to enter is a recreation of an authentic Paris street. It is on an uneven surface, therefore please watch your step. I just love that sign because when I look at it, I think like, and I haven't interviewed the designers who created the sign, nor Joel Bergman, who created Some of Paris. He's interviewed in my Immersive Worlds Handbook, so I could actually ask him, although the sign could be something that was done after the fact. But you know, in a lot of today's theme spaces, you often get a sign like this almost winking at you, right? It's sort of saying you're in on the joke. You know, perhaps, that this is not really an authentic street, right? And that gets to the level of the guests and to what degree, when any of us go to one of these spaces, we want to suspend our disbelief. It's just like if you're watching a movie, maybe you get to the first 10 minutes and you say, I can't watch the rest of this, or you're reading a novel and you just can't get into the style or the perspective or whatever. And indeed, to use the mode of aesthetics once again, I would say that if you're a writer, whether you're doing journalism or research academic writing or legal writing, or you're doing some sort of aesthetic project, performance studies, whatever, you're always sampling, right? You're taking key examples and you're rearranging it for the reader. When I was a student, not so much in my doctoral program, but my two previous anthropology programs, we often heard of this great case study of Clifford Geertz, the late anthropologist who did work in Bali, and he wrote a very famous piece that was anthologized and republished everywhere called The Balinese Cockfight. And the critique of this particular piece was that Geertz had gone to hundreds of cockfights, took copious notes, and then when he wrote his article, he created this recreation, right? So he created a version that is it's what we call the ethnographic present. So it gives the perception that all this happened at the same time, when in fact Geertz studied cockfights over the years, different places and different times. And so that temporal and that spatial conflating into one final form in an ethnographic text is, you could say comparatively, you could compare it to some of the stuff happening in the world of theme parks. And this is an example of that. What does this look like to you? What is this scene here? It's not a trick question. What is it? Yeah, so it's a library space. So it's a library space. This is actually from, I was at a conference in Southern California in Newport Beach, but it's going to, I think the whole point of this is going to come to surface when I put it in color, and there it is. And so what was amazing about this, when we saw this, what's happening here? How did the color change how you see this image? It enriches it, but what was very peculiar about this, and what was striking to us when we saw it, and I was with she's our vice president of instruction. She has her PhD in English from the University of Michigan, and she was really struck with the fact that these are organized by color, right? So if you have just this image, you think, oh, it's a library, and indeed I could look at all the different titles here. But once they do this move, which is to take all the black books and put them there, and all the blue ones are there, and all the white ones are here, and we started even wondering, did they specially order books on eBay or Amazon or something that had, how did they get these exact, they took the dust jackets off, they're all hardback. But, this is a move, right, that gets us, I think, into the modality of the criticism of theme parks, because essentially we've gone from a library and a text that has its own stylistic arrangement, right? It's laid out in such a way, and we could talk about the wood and so forth, and the vases and the spatial organization, the vertical versus the horizontal order here. But once you see the color, then I think that does really get into this world of remaking, right? And the designer making a design choice that all of a sudden shifts the purpose, in this case of the viewer, how I interact with this space. And it may seem very mundane and so forth, but I think this is a great example of just how a very simple design choice like this, organizing books in a typical library wall by color, suggests something entirely different about maybe the project of what's happening in theme spaces. And now I'll talk about This is a recent, and I'll mention this later, I do a lot of work with video, and it's one way that I see of taking a traditional research on theme parks beyond text and beyond academic discourse and doing something more through the realm of audio-visual worlds. So this is a place I had a chance to visit. Whenever I go anywhere, I try to take my cameras with me and do a video if I can and put it up on my YouTube site. It's a place called Safehouse, and the original one started in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and they're starting this as a chain, and I think Singapore. I mean, there's certain stops, that have very, immersive traditions. This restaurant is hoping to branch out. It's essentially spy themed. You sit down, you order off a menu. Everything in this place is themed, down to the salt and pepper shakers, to the names of, and some of the names are a bit offensive when you think about like the Stasi in East Germany and that history. I mean, some of that probably shouldn't be themed. It gets themed a little bit here. And it's entirely an exploration. So after you order your food, your wait person tells you, if you'd like, you can go explore. There are panels, there are tricks that happen, there are all sorts of technological and immersive things. And so I had this moment when I was leaving the restaurant. I asked the waiter, I heard there's 2 exits, and which, can you tell me? And he said, oh, it's this exit here. And you go through this maze, and it's almost like in a spy movie. There are lasers that you have to walk over, kind of like in a James Bond, a heist movie. And you have a secret agent tag, and that's why all those stickers are there. So anyway, you exit the door, and this was for me a moment. If you've read Walter Benjamin's The Work of Art in the Age of Its Mechanical Reproducibility, it's a work that talks about technology and the idea that as art becomes, or journalism, as we move beyond originals, something of the aura of that original work of art is lost as we reproduce things via technology. And I had a moment like this where I couldn't quite distinguish between the real and the fictive. So you exit that door there, and I didn't get a good shot, but you go into this lobby, and I open the door, and there are 2 people standing there, and they appear to be hotel clerks who might check you into the hotel. And then I walked through the lobby, and I looked around. I had this moment where I thought, is this a real hotel or not? And it was a truly authentic moment of not knowing. And I thought it was so wonderful to talk about, effacing what's real and what's fictive. And I often find that moments like that, when you have them in a theme space, you're almost like breaking down the guise of being a researcher, because you're enjoying it for its pure pleasure as a guest might enjoy it. And the other thing I'd indicate about this is it really does show us that the technologies of theme parks, and I just did a piece on this list about how theme park technologies have impacted urban domains. So the theming of town centers, place branding, and all this kind of stuff. Well, I would say a theme restaurant like Safehouse is part of the evolution. If we were drawing a diagram, it certainly is in the domain of what we call theme parks. And so it's one of many opportunities, and I would say if you're studying theme parks or whatever you're doing, to get out and actually see the spaces, there's a joy in doing this. And as you go from one culture to the next, I was talking to my guide at KidZania in London yesterday, and she said, oh, I've been to 3 in Mexico, I've been to the one in Dubai, and she was just talking about working at KidZania and how it gives her an opportunity to see things from a different perspective of how that same experience happens in another culture. So getting out and
KidZania might not be familiar.
Yeah, so KidZania it's quite amazing. I mean, it's shocking depending on your perspective on brands. It's a mini themed town, and it's basically for children between 4 and 14. And I wish I could have my photos from yesterday up here, but they are in this mini themed town, and they do all sorts of work practices. So they pretend to be airline pilots, they pretend to be doctors, they actually have organ operations that they simulate. They can work in a burger shop, they can't be an anthropologist, they can't be an attorney. What other fields are in here? I think anthropologists would actually be cool. They can be a journalist, and the journal activity, and Charlotte and I during our tour today, we were talking about this, but they pay so they have a plaque, and it will say, if you complete the activity here, you'll earn, they call them KidZos, they're kid dollars, and they can even open up a bank account and take their money out of an ATM machine. Yeah, it's over the top. It's way like consumerist branded. But so the journalists, they start in the newspaper office, and then they go around, they do these mock interviews, and they come back, and if they complete that, they get 20, the equivalent of 20 of these kid dollars. And it's just absolutely, I mean, if you have kids, and I was able to get in to do a tour, but yeah, you have to go to London to Westfield to check this out, because it was one of those moments where I thought, like, it was completely amazing, but then another side of me thought, like, oh, wow, this is really teaching kids to be, right? I mean, it's that whole model that we critique in the social sciences and cultural studies and economics, whatever, of you're training kids at an early age not to be citizens, but to be consumers, or maybe citizen consumers or something like this. So yeah, KidZania, absolutely just mind-blowing themed experience. Yeah, so as I was explaining, so this stuff I do here, here's a shot of me at Disney, and I was hoping that the folks from attractions management would make it out here today, but I've done a lot of work with them. This is coming out in a book they do called Plaid Book, and what's really fascinating to me about this is, it's very glossy, it's very much photo-based, and, the call-out boxes, but I find as a researcher coming from the world of doing, 10,000 or 20,000 word chapters or articles, it's kind of refreshing sometimes to have a challenge of presenting your research in a format like this where you have maybe 1,000 words or maybe 1,500. That's the first, constraint of doing the writing. The second is making your work accessible to a wider audience. And my, I guess, not inspiration, but subversive intent or something is to say, can I use my background as an academic and as an anthropologist to influence some conversation or some approach in the world of themed entertainment design? Essentially, excuse me, the folks reading this particular work won't be academics necessarily. Some of them are trained architects perhaps. But so for me, it's an opportunity to challenge myself as a researcher, to consider new research venues, and to also hopefully, as I'll talk about at the end, develop more collaboration among people between the industry and also between academia. And so in this particular research focus, I'm visiting a Starbucks, very boutique Starbucks roastery in Seattle, and then also a typical IKEA store. I've always been fascinated with IKEA as a brand and as a space, how you navigate it and so forth. So for me, it's a challenge. And indeed, some of my work, it's always interesting to see if a student of mine from Nanyang Technological in Singapore, I'm on his dissertation committee, just I think successfully completed. He's doing fascinating work on Chinese heritage and trying to imagine ways of using his background as an animator to create, I want to say accurate, but attractions that are really in tune with issues of heritage and issues of tradition and history. And so he actually took this photo for me and said, oh, your books were at Aiyappa in Asia. And it's always interesting to me because Immersive Worlds was written with a press that they typically do photography books and web publishing and computer books. And I pitched this and they were quite interested in it. But Theme Park, which is based London's Reaction Press, and actually have been bothering me for another monograph, so I have to get on that because they do some wonderful work, but not really what I would consider a hands-on guide. So over the years, you'll note my research has evolved more towards design practices and doing collaborative work. As an example, the fellow from Toronto I was mentioning in the context of Canada's Wonderland, Gordon Grice, we've done quite a bit of collaborative work together. He used to work at the firm Forak, and they do all sorts of museum and theme park design. This was actually an article we did for attractions management, but we presented a year back at Aiyappa, and Aiyappa is the really big amusement industry conference that happens in Orlando every year. I'm not going this year because of my travels in Europe. Joel Beckerman was also involved in our panel, and he's a composer, and he does sound design, and he designs sounds for spaces. And so what we tried to imagine here was how the senses could be used in combination with one another in themed and immersive spaces. Again, this is not an academic publication, but it's an opportunity to do two things, to challenge myself as an academic who also operates somewhat in these worlds of industry, and then also to collaborate with people in industry and hopefully create a dialogue and opportunities for future research. If you ever go to Aiyappa, these are some of my shots. I mean, it's just amazing. There are panels there. There are attraction exhibits. I always go when I do actually live casts on Facebook. It's kind of exciting, and I try everything out, and it's always exciting to see 5 or 6 people watching me, you know, when I'm doing this. But essentially, it's 2,000 or more booths of all the various ride manufacturers, people designing new innovative forms of cotton candy, you name it. It all happens at Aiyappa. So it's a great opportunity to see things from a different perspective. Now, again, the typical side of seeing things is probably more from what is reflected in this new collection. This is the one you can download freely. You can purchase the hard copy book, but you can also download it on the internet. It's open source. And in it, I offer this chapter called Judgments Past. And in particular, I was trying to get at, going back to the beginning of my talk, this issue of how social critics have viewed the theme park as an exemplar of the ills of consumer society. So the Pulitzer Prize winning architect Paul Goldberger talks about how theme parks essentially are known for doing certain kinds of architecture that is very stereotypical. Ada Louise Huxtable, who wrote her famous book, The Unreal America, which delved into everything from Las Vegas casinos to historical reenactment at Colonial Williamsburg, says something very similar. And I was particularly trying to work with this literature and ask some questions about, well, what is really valid about the criticism of theme parks? And I engage in this particular work with a lot of the literature actually on literary criticism, and I talk a little bit about where the problems are and why people see these spaces as problematic. And these are some of the critiques. So those of you that have studied theme parks, certainly you know this work. And it's the problem of copying with mimesis. It's the problem of authenticity. It's the issue of stereotyping, as I talked about earlier. Escapism, the hegemony of the spaces and so forth. And these are all valid criticisms. But what I've been trying to suggest in my work lately is that maybe we should find new opportunities to create collaborations, new forms of research that imagine something other than that very typical argument that gets applied to the theme park. And again, a lot of that goes back to the 70s and the 80s and Umberto Eco and Jean Baudrillard and how they envisioned this new phenomenon of hyper-reality happening in the US through Disneyland in '55 and Las Vegas starting in that same era, and then of course moving into the 80s and the 90s where we get all of the theme casinos really developing in that era. So these are just some of the examples of some of the things that you'll find on my YouTube site. Has over 900 videos. Anytime I go somewhere, I often will plan my travel. So my last trip to Germany at this time, we had a trip to Bonn where our academic site was for the first Theme Park Studies Conference. And so I made some side trips to Nuremberg because I do a lot on dark theming and history, and there's so much of that in Europe and particularly in Germany. So I often will stay at a themed hotel, or I will try to find examples of theming that are out there that I can use, again, to present to my viewers. And I don't have a big viewership on YouTube. It's maybe 900 subscribers or so. But some people find it interesting, and in particular as a researcher, and this is my highest viewed video, and I did a project with my college and for my sabbatical, and it was on YouTube, and I was particularly interested in, I haven't quite figured this out, but I think it's a combination of keywords and the topic, but this is by far my highest viewed video. It's somewhere over 45,000 views. My one on the Singapore airport, Changi Airport, which I love that airport. It's the one airport you want to stay I don't know, I love that. I could stay a week at that airport. I mean, there's just so much to see there. But that one is in second place. But what I find fascinating is, so a lot of people watch these videos and then they offer comments like this. And this one was just so, I mean, I don't know these people, but the person was just, it was just kind of charming, you know. My wife lived there and we lived in LA, we visited Vegas. We went in the 90s. I love themed environments. And then just talking about like, because what happened with the Monte Carlo, it's now changed. It's called the Park MGM. And so I did this video the last time I was in Vegas, and I was trying to chronicle the end of an era. So it's called Goodbye Monte Carlo. And I find it interesting that people, in some cases, they argue with me. That they're again not giving an academic perspective. There's nothing academic about it, but there's something that's, I think, quite uplifting about that. Just as a researcher, to see your work reaching a larger public audience through audiovisual means. These are not typically academic videos, though I do some minor level of analysis where I talk about the eras at the Monte Carlo and some of the changes. But I just love this kind of stuff where people give these comments and they're just, you know, often reminiscing on nostalgic images they have, to go back to Imaginaries, of theme parks or theme casinos. So I mentioned, you know, Baudrillard, and one opportunity I think with this work is to say that a lot of theorists have suggested that theme parks or theme spaces offer an opportunity to see images of ourselves, so versions of ourselves. And I think there's something quite valid to that. So, for example, and I just wrote about this in my piece on urban studies, you know, this is a site, you can't see it, but there's a logo right there that says Disney Springs. And Disney Springs, if you know, it used to be downtown Disney. This is the version in Orlando. I know they'll be doing probably other versions. They created a fictional town, and it's very interesting because it has layers of history. They have a sort of primogenitor founder who's a farmer, of course. It's very agrarian. He has a shed, and then that shed becomes the burger restaurant. I mean, it's very Disney. It's very detailed. It has a very rich backstory. The problem, of course, for a critic is that there's nothing real about it, right? And in fact, the conservationists in Florida who are really concerned about the plight of actual springs, because this is a faux spring. There's like glass in the bottom, and it's very well done. It's very beautiful. You know, this is a fake water pump and all this. But when Disney talked about doing this retheming, the conservationists were very concerned because they said, well, we don't think this is going to do anything for the plight of real springs out there, and we really wish that people could see this as a concern and so forth. So I guess what I would offer is, you know, if you look at a site like Disney Springs, we do have certain projections of our imaginary. So we can talk about nature, we can talk about consumption, we could talk about brands, we could talk about the family. Those of you studying childhood issues, you know, you could also find this here. And I don't know if theme parks will ever lose those domains of experience. My hope is that they'll be more critical of them. For example, if it's the family, I hope theme parks are promoting more diverse notions of families or gender, LGBTQ issues, and not just assuming there's one family and it's a white heteronormative family that's upper middle class or something like this. So I think the need for diversification, if the projection of the image goes back onto the theme park and the designers, is a real opportunity for some innovation. You can take a walk down, you know, iconic site like Main Street USA, and I could just ask you, what do you think of when you see, or you've been to Main Street USA? What image does it conjure in your mind? What do you see as Main Street USA?
40 skyscrapers. What castles?
Yeah. Maybe the scale of the architecture, right, and the faux nature of it.
An imagination of an America that never was.
Never existed.
I think it's based on Missouri.
Mm-hmm. Marceline, Missouri,
Yeah,
Walt's
Missouri.
childhood home.
I'm not sure I'd want to go to Marceline, Missouri. It's a long way out of the places in America
Right.
I visit, but it's quite nice to have this faux sanitized version that I can imagine oldie town America without actually having to go.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, it's all of these things. It's many other things. I mean, it's also, I always think of the consumption side of things, to go back to KidZania, right? It's like training kids and families to, I mean, the whole street, in addition to the architecture, it really is about the consumption practices. It's buying things. It's experiencing, you know, narratives that have been created for you that often have much similarity. I mean, you know, the different Disney theme parks, when you go from one nation to another, differ, but there's a lot that they have in common. And I think, again, for a researcher, for any of us going to Main Street USA, it's a much different version or image maybe we have, particularly for capturing a photo of this for our research purposes. In the case of a typical guest, you know, the anthropologist in me would want to know, what is that person thinking, or what are they doing? You know, if you could follow them throughout the course of the day, and you could do this research, but you could see everything they do, you could see everything they imagine, you could take copious notes, you could do interviews with them and ask them all sorts of questions about what exactly are you doing here? Why are you drawn to this theme park? And that's what we call the ethnographic project in anthropology, is that we're really trying to get to what we call the emic level, or the insider's level, the quotidian, the everyday, how people experience things. And I think in my own research, I bring a lot of this to my work, not just because I worked in a theme park, but because I'm trained in a discipline that says you really have to try to approach things from the perspective of how they happen on the ground. And that's a problem with the version of the French post-structuralists, is that they often see things through this lens of things up here, right? It's at the level of theory and not actually getting into what happens in the culture. Now, I know Charlotte and perhaps others, you know, you're looking at theme parks and its contexts related to childhood. And I think it's a fascinating approach, because I don't think it's been done before. I mean, there have probably been articles written on it, but to have an actual research-focused agenda on the child or the family, I think, is quite fascinating. The curious thing, for me at least, as a footnote here, and this is Circus Circus, is when Vegas casinos take a theme, right? They take something that's childlike, like clowns, and they transform it in a casino. And I once had a bit of an argument on the phone with one of the Las Vegas casinos. I won't say which one, because if this video is public, but we were arguing about whether or not they were, basically the extent of it in my book Theme Park, I wanted to talk about casinos, because I was trying to suggest that the trajectory of theme parks lands up or ends up in the direction of themed casinos. And they were quite concerned. They said, well, we don't want to give the impression to the public that we're marketing to children. And I said, and you'll know which casino, and I said, well, you have clowns and you have, you know, circus games and all that stuff. How can you not say that you're marketing, right, to children? It seems kind of ludicrous. But that I think is an interesting dimension, is when you get, I almost call it like a liminal, it's a state of betwixt and between. It's not quite adult, it's not quite child, but it's in between that. And maybe there's a tension, right? Maybe there's a tension there. I think when MGM experimented with its own theme park in the late 80s? It didn't go over well. They had a little water park there at the MGM. Maybe that was an indication that Vegas wasn't ready for a theme park experience, maybe just a themed experience. So I find this, you know, focus on you know, the childhood utopia or the adult dystopia, and I'll end on the adult dystopia, to be quite fascinating. We can also look at theme parks as, you know, projecting images of us. I mean, again, this goes back to the beginning of the talk. I think, you know, remember your visit to Africa. It seems a little silly, right, to theme one theme land based on an entire continent. If you've studied African cultures, you know it's not possible to do this. And even these picture spots, and I think they're no longer Kodak. I think another company took over. But, you know, it does suggest, I think, that very base level of the guest experience that perhaps critics are identifying rightly, and that is that we're participating in something that is maybe, I don't know, do I say shameful? Do I say problematic? Do I say I don't know, right? But I mean, it's just stuff like this, it makes me cringe a little bit, right? When I'm there seeing it, I just sort of think that's quite maybe inappropriate. And I sort of lead to this, and I would ask, we could make a whole list here of what the theme park asks us to be. For example, if you walk down Main Street USA, you're asked to be a consumer, right? Now, you don't have to. You could pay your admission ticket and your $25 for parking or whatever, and it's very expensive. I mean, it's very expensive to go to a Disney theme park. But I suppose you could experience that theme park in a way that is subversive. There were folks in the 70s and 80s in the States who were dropping acid and going to Disney theme parks because they thought, oh, this would be an alternative way of experiencing it. There's a group actually based in Exeter, Rights and Sights. I don't know, I've been in contact with a few of the folks there. They do sort of, if you know, the Situationists International. They were a art collective back in the 60s who wanted to look at geography and space and come up with performance or aesthetic techniques to break down the hegemony or the definitions of space suggested by the designer. So you could use a technique of the Situationists International, psychogeography, and experience a theme park space in a non-traditional sense. But I think, a lot of times, again, to go back to my earlier part of the talk, the theme park asks us to think in cultural essences. It asks us to be a consumer. It asks us to have certain values. We were talking in the hallway before we entered the seminar room today about why certain words only get used for the child experience at a theme park. Words like wonder, or fantasy, or dreaming. So I often think on the right side, we could write in things like, what could the theme park actually be? And this is kind of where I'll end the talk today. And it's like, for me, it's opportunities to imagine new designs in theme parks, new forms of theme park criticism, new contexts, new values. As I mentioned earlier, I don't know if consumption will ever go away as far as being a central focus of the theme park. This is actually from a piece I did talking about a visit to Europa Park, which is in Germany. And this is another representation. When I see it, I cringe a little bit because I think, hey, it's just right. I mean, you're doing the same thing. It has that visceral sense that you think.
Ride.
Yeah, so you know the ride, yeah. A lot of cultural stereotyping. Well, curiously enough, I met with a designer before my visit, and I talk about this experience. And he was actually the architect, and this is some of his room here, his drawings. And he designed the Iceland theme land, which at the time, this was quite a few years ago, it was a brand new theme land there. And so I said, oh, well, could you tell me a little bit, take me through your design practice, and how do you sit down as a designer, as an architect, and come up with Iceland? And I was just kind of shocked at his transparency. And he said, well, I just Googled the word Iceland on the computer, and these images come up. And indeed, I think some of the images, right, it was so transparent. And I said, oh, well, that's interesting because, and he said, oh, I know. All the critics, he said, yeah, all the academics, they say what we're doing is stereotyping, and they're kind of right. And I said, oh, it was just one of these moments where I cut through all these layers of walls and facades, and he just was absolutely just honest, like brutally honest. And I found that interesting, and it was a reminder that, well, sometimes we say there is nuance in design, but in some cases, often there's a simplicity, and it could be because of resources, it could be because of timelines, and actually they just had a big fire. If you know the Piraten in Batavia, it's their rip-off ride of Pirates in the Caribbean. I shouldn't say rip-off, but their copy. And it actually burned down, but it's a very beloved ride, and I just heard from my contacts in Germany that they're rebuilding it. But so in any case, I end with these points about new design imaginations. And for me, this would be suggestions of how theme parks could be less traditional and could go into some new terrains, as well as some of those research contexts I've been talking about. These are all images from World Expo 2015 in Milan, and I think I have 72 videos on World Expo, and that gives you a sense of how big it is. The one in Dubai coming up is going to be probably 5 times the size, but this is from Pavilion 0, which was all about ecology and biodiversity and global warming. This next one was quite conceptual. This was the Swiss Pavilion. They had 4 properties, salt, or objects, if you will, commodities, salt, water, apple, and coffee. And as a guest, you had the opportunity to take as much as you wanted of these. But as you did, these bins went away, and then, as you can see up there, they got lower and lower. So it was an attempt, conceptually, to use the space to get the guest to realize his or her complicity or involvement in the draining of resources. And some of these are, basic resources like water or salt. So I found that to be quite interesting. In another quite different context in Germany, this is Daniel Liebeskind's Jewish Museum, Berlin. And this is one where he uses design, these pillars, the cobblestone floor, as well as, you can't see it here, changes in elevation to create an almost queasy feeling as you're walking through the space. And he says, there's a plaque, I don't have it pictured here, but he says, for me, this is a conceptual representation of the darkness of Berlin. And Berlin is a city, when you visit its many spaces, its museums, its city streets, where it's this, it's the Vergangenheitsbewältigung, it's the atonement for the past that is a part of German curriculum. And so for me, spaces like this, which are non-representational, which are abstract, and owe much more to, say, conceptual artists or land artists or folks dealing with space and theming in a different immersive sense. This I would like to see more of, actually, in the realm of theme parks and theme spaces. And this next one is a pure, just indulge me for a second, but this is, so I posted this on, and you can read the text here, but Neil Silberman is a heritage researcher, and I did a piece for him in his new book on postmodern heritage. And he was asking me one time, and so I'm coming here in between all the apocalyptic stuff happening with President Trump, I hate saying that, and our Supreme Court, and if you've been following it, it's just an absolute abomination. But he was asking sort of in jest, he's like, can you imagine the worldview of the typical Trump supporter as a theme park? And I sort of thought of this project, and I say, would it be kind of cool to create, to take all the key iconic symbols, and there's this crazy kitsch artist that's Trump doing like this sort of founding fathers thing. He does all these images of Trump as this like heroic figure. There's the idea of Trump wanting to build the wall, not across Mexico, but across the Sahara. There's Trump coming down in his escalator. There's his stupid hat, and I'm sorry, I can't edit myself on this. But you know, of course, that Trump is represented, and I think it's a great representation. This is from the Hall of Presidents at Disney. It looks kind of like a zombie. I think it's a very fitting. So my project here, and it's sort of a conceptual thing, but I wanted to imagine, and I don't have like the skills to do this visually, but I wanted to create, like on my YouTube site, like a fictive imagination of the Trump presidential library, right? Like, what would the rooms be? What would the map be, the layout? So if any of you want to do this, like create this like fictive project with me, it could be my therapy, because I have to go back to this worldview of Trump when I go back to the States. But yeah, so it's kind of my imagination of using the theme park as a mode of social criticism. And again, the attractions management people aren't here today, but they did this really nice piece on Banksy's Dismal Land. And Dismal Land was this art collective that was, I think, I didn't get a chance to go, a friend of mine did, but it was only there for about 6 months. Had a lot of mixed reception in both the journalistic worlds and the academic worlds, but it was using the imaginaries of theme parks, the castle, the Mickey Mouse, but in a much different sense. And it gets into that realm of what I've called dark theming. And my argument in this piece for attractions management is to say, like, can we imagine theme parks going back to some of the traditions we actually saw? That's a picture from Coney Island, Fighting the Flames, a very famous attraction. Can we imagine opportunities to push the limits in future design? And this is where I'll end today. So we could imagine, new contexts, both in how we see the theme park as researchers, as guests, and how the theme park sees us. Maybe the theme park of the future will be more civically minded, and it won't be about being a consumer if I visit it. There'll be new design modes, so if I'm thinking about space and new senses, maybe I get beyond the iconography of Main Street USA, and I totally dispose of that and I do something entirely different. If I'm thinking about the values of theme parks, could theme parks approach more of what's happening at the World Expo and those images I showed you of the Swiss Pavilion? If I ask a consumer, a guest, whatever I call this person at the theme park, to be more aware, if you just saw the recent climate reports, which Trump already has dismissed, what did they say? We have until 2030 to fix this, or the planet, I mean, the planet's going to explode basically, right? Like, how do you get people out of that consumer mode? How do you get people out of the modes of racism and homophobia and classism and all the kind of stuff that I have to say, unfortunately, is sweeping Europe? It's happening in Brazil, it's happening in the States. I mean, it's you know, in different degrees, the emergence of fascism and reemergence of xenophobia and all this kind of horrible stuff. So I'm not saying that theme parks should necessarily educate the public, but if these are the spaces that people frequent, can we imagine opportunities to stress new values in theme parks? Maybe it's totally crazy, I don't know. And then lastly, for those of us studying theme parks, can we think of ways to extend our research, to come up with new research models, whether it's those in the realm of audiovisual worlds or collaborative models and so forth. So yeah, those are sort of my ending points. So, and I've probably talked too much. I've droned on too much, perhaps. So if you have questions or comments, or you want to talk about what you're doing in your projects. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a part of the research I do. There was an attraction, I mean, I've been to escape rooms. There's one in Las Vegas that is using part of his experience as an escape room based on The Walking Dead, the famous comic and television show, video game. And it's very much, if it were in a theme park, I'd say it's a theme park attraction, but it's on Fremont Street, which
There is such an attraction at Thorpe Park.
There is. Oh, there too.
A Walking Dead.
Oh, wow.
Maze with an
Yeah.
horror maze with escape
I wonder if
elements.
it's the same designer at Thorpe Park.
Park.
Yeah.
It's a theme park on the periphery of London.
Yeah. But the particular one in Vegas is, it starts as an escape room, then there's a video game with shooting, there's a ride component. So what I've discovered is that if you go to Aiyappa, and actually that particular ride escape room was a mini version of it, they had it at Aiyappa, there isn't a big distinction. I think there's more what we call hybridity, where video game worlds and theme park worlds are intersecting. And it's very smart from a marketing perspective. If kids are growing up with video games and social media, you try to bring some of that in and you make it part of your new attraction. So it's part of this landscape, but being able to define, you know, a proper theme park attraction versus a dungeon versus an escape room, I think it's almost impossible to distinguish that academically or within the design world, because those people are designing for multiple spaces. The people who do the educational attractions for the Expo in Milan, at the same time they design theme park rides. So it's very likely some of those same designers have their hands in multiple spaces for museums, for dungeons, for escape rooms, for theme park attractions. So
I was reading the Merlin Entertainment's annual report. Merlin have virtually a monopoly on major British theme parks, and also they have the dungeons, I think all of them now, and they also have a very strange hybrid thing in London, in the very centre of London, with a view of Big Ben, which used to be the London Aquarium and is now Shrek's Adventure.
Ah.
And that really does push the boundaries of how we define theme parks. It's a themed space, it's themed to Shrek, not entirely surprisingly. There are animatronics. You, however, are taken on a guided path. This is not something you can explore at your leisure. There is one thing that we might recognise precisely as a ride. It's a 4D attraction, but generally speaking, the idea is you can live the movie. And you can meet animatronics at Donkey, and you can meet the baker who makes the gingerbread man, and you get sort of little mementos of your journey going round, and then rather incongruously at the end you can meet the characters from, well, when I went to Madagascar, which had just been released, well, Madagascar 3 had just been released, and just like Disneyland, they're big fur characters, you have a cuddle, you have a picture. But what interested me in the Merlin annual report was they said that they're very keen to introduce what they're calling these sort of medium-sized hybrid attractions, rather than build necessarily new theme parks. That's not to say they won't, but, or indeed extend significantly the theme parks they already have. Because the advantage of these mid-sized hybrid attractions is they're a lot cheaper to build than theme parks. You're running one ride rather than 20. You can control the flow of people, because the problem you have in theme parks is as soon as theme parks abolished the paper ride model, which was a very long time ago for the great majority of theme parks, you can't actually stop people lingering about all day. But with this, you get a time ticket, you're led through, so the throughput's amazing, the merchandising opportunities are ever present, the ability to re-theme to new films that come out is pretty straightforward. Again, if you're trying to transform the theme of a roller coaster, there's quite a lot to do. This is styrofoam and actors. And I thought that was interesting. To be frank, I didn't much enjoy the attraction, but I could see why from an economic point of view, and indeed it was absolutely packed because it's next to the London Eye. And what you can do is you can get a combination ticket, very heavily marketed to tourists, very heavily marketed in the airports, that does the London Dungeons, the London Eye, and Shrek's Adventures, and that is in a strange way portrayed as you've done London.
I can't help but comment that very ironically, that's like what a theme park is to the real world, that is like a theme park to a theme park. It's like you take the ideas of a theme park.
And you compress it into but it's very smart from a marketing standpoint. You control the narrative, the IP for, a lot of theme parks, I don't have Fantasyland up here, but they struggle with, they have their own intellectual property. They don't have Star Wars or Avatar, or Walking Dead or whatever. So that becomes another issue, is that when like Disney starts this project of coming up with a new theme park, they actually don't say we're going to come up with a new theme park, but they come up with multiple tracks, so merchandising, television, video games, theme parks. So you sort of start like at a lower foundation, because in the Disney world it is, transmedia and IP is really transforming the theme park industry as we speak, because we're no longer going to maybe have, a Western theme land. It's going to be Star Wars or Avatar and Pandora. The other thing in your question I would say is, it's very interesting when there's this blurring of the museum and the theme park. And I think of Jorvik, as you know, in York. And you sort of look at Jorvik and you say, well, this is not really a theme park, but is it really a museum? And you go on the ride that's sort of like Pirates of the Caribbean, a low version meets, archaeology. And so I find that blurring quite interesting, where you can't, and you're holding your face, right? I don't know what locals think of Jorvik, but I found it fascinating, to put archaeology in this world of a theme park ride. So.
I went to Jorvik recently. I've actually still got to write up the notes for you on this.
Oh, good.
And I remember going as a child when it first opened. Jorvik is an attraction in central York, which reflects York's considerable Viking heritage.
I don't have something similar in Dublin as well, or Ireland, or museums.
Oh, really?
I think it's called Jorvik because that's what the Vikings called the York.
Okay. Yeah.
And you go through 3 very separate and quite incongruous stages.
Yeah.
And stage 1, you have actors recreating the role of Vikings. When I went, it was a really quiet day, and there weren't many of them, but I've seen busier days when they will act out sort of little scenarios and little plays. And then you move from that to the ride, which they're very, very keen not to call a ride. And before you're allowed to get to the ride, you go through what's a fairly dry, though sort of using a lot of multimedia effects, account of how the archaeology was done and why Jorvik is placed where it is. And there's a great many video interviews with the archaeologists involved, and you can map present-day York onto the sites where they found various Viking artifacts. And then you're allowed on the ride, and all the kids I saw were like, zoof.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is lovely. We want the thing that moves. And it's less Pirates of the Caribbean, it's more Peter Pan's flight.
Yeah.
Because it's a suspended ride, and you have an audio-visual screen in front of you. You choose the language, which plays videos and tells you about what you're seeing, but you go through a reproduction of a Viking town. And that reproduction involves some animatronics, but it's mainly waxworks and artifacts. Again, the video is very keen to stress that what you're seeing is not the role of the imagination of some Imagineer, but is, and they will introduce, this is Hildred, she has a stoop, and they say, we know this because we have found a skeleton of a woman in her 50s, we've reconstructed what she probably looked like, this is the person you're seeing, and we know that she had a stoop. And you get off the ride, and the first thing you see is a bank of skeletons. And some of the children inevitably start screaming. But what you're seeing are the skeletons that they've excavated upon which they've based the wax figures.
Wait, those are the real skeletons of them?
Yes.
Then they just put them on display there?
Yes.
What?
These are the real skeletons that they've really dug up in York. And so there is this incongruous thing that you've just sort of seen Hildred wave at you selling fish, and now suddenly
you see
Hildred is there.
It's there.
That's like
As
bones and all.
Yeah.
And that's really Hildred.
Yeah.
And you're supposed to have a fun time. This is entertainment.
Yeah.
Well, they're very
There's
keen
your dark
to
theming.
stress
The borderland would be
that it's
Yeah.
They're very keen to stress, particularly in that final room, which is laid out really like a contemporary museum, with in fact, nothing by way of theming. You just go from case to case. There are information boards. They're very keen to stress that is because I interviewed some people who work there, that is the heart of Jorvik, that is the point of Jorvik, that you will see this large traditional museum about the Vikings, and effectively the ride that isn't a ride is just to lure the people in.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting place
It
combining
is.
darkness,
Yeah.
theming,
Museum,
and
theme park, technology.
quite an ending in quite an old-fashioned museum.
Yeah.
So, like, my question is, what do people get out of that? Because presumably the two of you have done research and you've interviewed people that have gone into the park. So, like, when a person says, I want to go to Jorvik Viking Center, and then he sits on it.
Yeah.
Again, going back to the idea of hyper reality, like, I mean, if I went there, I imagine I'd forget everything about Vikings and just be like, oh, there were skeletons.
This is
and
fun, yeah.
Roller coaster.
No, it's not a roller coaster. It's completely flat.
Yeah.
Okay, completely flat.
It's not fast. It's just very slow.
Okay, so it's like it's completely flat.
Yeah.
Like, what do people get out of it? What's the point? So when somebody goes to say Main Street USA in Disneyland, like, are they aware that this is a fictional representation of Marceline, or are they actually just struggling to go get a hamburger at the McDonald's?
Well, that's such a challenging question because, again, the anthropologist in me would say that, you know, people have different reasons as to why they visit these spaces, but then there is another side of me that has to look at it more globally and say, well, we live in a branded, a technological, immersive society, you know, ranging from our phones, our tablets, so we expect maybe that information is to be presented. I mean, the people who have studied the transformation of the book over time I remember when I was in graduate school, they were talking about hypertext and how, you know, it was going to transform everything, and now we don't really have hypertext per se, right? We click on links and we do all this. But so there's an expectation I think we have in terms of learning. And when I was at KidZania, I thought this is like the apotheosis of it. This is like really probably, and I even said to the woman giving me the tour, I said, oh, I'm sort of going back in time traveling and thinking this would have been fun as a kid. But then I thought, but does that make it good, or does that make it positive? Does that mean that's going to help the next generation of citizens in whatever culture deal with the really important issues? Probably not, right? Like, so that's a side of it where I think, like, what can we really do? And I'm not saying that theme parks or dungeons or even museums like Jorvik will solve the crises of our future, but it seems to me like something has to provide that. It may not be Facebook. We've discovered that probably affected our presidential election because of all the Russian hacking. I mean, so, but I think like there has to be a dimension of hopefully some of this. I mean, in the world of video games, I also write about video games. There's this whole world of serious gaming. And whenever I talk to hardcore gamers much younger than I am, they say like, I won't play that shit. That's, you know, I want something visceral. I want something immersive. I don't want to be told about how I'm going to solve the migrant crisis in Syria, you know? So I think the illusion maybe of someone like me who says, oh yeah, we're going to get someone to play serious games, and you're going to go to stores like Patagonia because they're the ones stressing carbon footprint and supply chain and labor practices. That's probably a small portion of most societies, right? So what I'd like to see happen with this is that it somehow leads to that social transformation, right? But is that really going to happen? Probably not. You know, so I don't know.
I think, as you mentioned in your book, interviewing people in themed spaces is really hard.
That's what I thought.
Because
No,
it's hard because the people who run the themed spaces require an awful lot of paperwork before you are allowed to, as an anthropologist or a sociologist, interview people. Now, that's not to say you can't casually fall into conversation, and that's not to say you can't do participant observation, but I mean, I can say who went to Jorvik. The day I went, it was a weekday, and
I gotta go to Jorvik. I got it. Are we still doing the Chessington World of it? Let's do it.
Demographics that goes are tourists to York. York is a significant tourist city, and Jorvik is presented to them as a slightly more fun way of learning about York's history. York has a couple of museums, but certainly the last time I visited them, they were very much in the traditional model of cases, printed information boards, perhaps occasionally an interactive video screen. So maybe Jorvik's a bit more fun than that. I can certainly say that the people who live locally don't go, and I wouldn't say that people who are going to York to see, say, the Minster, which is the major attraction of York, or to see the architecture of York, as serious adults. are necessarily likely to go. If they knew about the last room, and the really quite interesting artifacts that have been found, maybe they'd go.
Yeah.
But they think of Jorvik. There's a load of kids in school uniform. They're all talking about a ride.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something for serious cultural tourism.
Yeah.
So I think the final question from my side
Yeah.
was pick up on, I think, the very interesting work you just mentioned and the problem you're raising about how to potentially make them more critical spaces. I'm wondering if looking at other branches of research, maybe there's interesting insights that sheds on economics and policy type paradigms where the research methodology relies very heavily on sort of game type situations and extrapolating from those into decision making in the real world. And on the one hand, that might, I'm not that familiar with that literature, but it might provide potentially a bit more optimism maybe for where constructing a critical theme space might work.
Yeah.
Or alternatively, it might be that your insights actually cast doubt on some of the I don't know, the validity of that research or the ability of that research in real policy setting.
Yeah, I don't know if we would require a cultural shift, if it's certain types of spaces that would promote what I call dark theming or more political topics. I mean, I think Dismal Land that Banksy did, it's a certain, and he just had his latest stunt, which I think is kind of funny, the shredding painting, which I guess increased the value of it. So, but I don't know, maybe I tend to think that it's more the art world, and back in my previous life, I did it much more with performance studies and concept art and aesthetics, and I often thought like the way that people in those worlds, and I'm generalizing, see the world and require us. See, the other one is gender studies. You take any class in gender studies, and the first thing you learn is positionality, right? You have to put yourself as a being in social spaces relative to your sexual orientation. Are you cisgender, transgender, your social class, your ethnicity, and so like more awareness and more opportunities to see your privilege and so forth. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen in a themed space, but my worry is that if these are the spaces, when I was talking to the guide at KidZania, she said, well, do you have to clear your educational policies or plans with all the local schools for these school visits? She said, oh, not at all. Madame Tussauds is considered legitimate. I said, Madame Tussauds, like, I guess it doesn't take much to get a school visit. And I'm thinking, if a wax museum with mostly American and maybe I guess some British celebrities classifies as a pedagogical visit,
and the horror dungeon,
and the horror dungeon too, that's a school visit. So
no, sorry, there is a horror dungeon within.
Oh, within. Okay, I've never. I maybe need to go, but so I don't know how to answer this question, but I know that we need something. We need an intervention. It's not going to happen necessarily from the world of theme parks, but so many of us, when we grow up, we get our basic identities, our gender identities, our understandings of the universe, our understandings of consumption and brands from popular culture. Theme parks are one subset of pop culture, along with video games and fashion and movies and all forms of entertainment. So my hope is that somehow, if the transformation happens, it could happen within these industries. The woman I was meeting with talking about gender yesterday in a totally different context, she is envisioning this sort of shift. And I sort of said like, wow, you have a really big and ambitious project here, but she's going for it. And she's like, we have to try, we have to do this, because if London and the UK claims to be so diverse, and yet you open up the fashion catalogs and it's all white, skinny, straight women, that is pretty problematic. And able-bodied women as well. So I mean, like, there are opportunities. I don't know where we begin, but I just think we have to do something, because you turn on the news and I mean, it's not just with Trump, but Brexit, and you see the crises everywhere in Europe. I mean, it's like this, something needs to change. So if theme parks get darker, I really think it could be an opportunity, but I don't know if they'll get darker. So
I have a question, sort of research proposal. I think in all the Disney theme parks there is, and I use this phrase very advisedly, a heart of darkness, which is Adventureland.
Oh.
Now, there are elements of Adventureland in every Disney theme park, and I've visited every one, that portray some image of, I don't know whether it's Orientalism or even colonialism.
Mm-hmm. Colonialism for sure, yeah.
Certainly colonialism, as a halcyon adventure age.
Mm-hmm.
And I am amazed in Walt Disney World. There's a ride called Jungle Cruise, as you well know, it's also at Disneyland. Yeah. It's not found, it's in Japan, but it's very different in Japan. And it's themed entirely in the queue to a sort of colonial expedition, and it's very clear that 1930s music's playing, and you have pith helmets and the traditional outfits of colonisers, British colonisers, and then you get on these boats which are themed to the African Queen, which was a pretty old movie.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point, natives appear, and they are people of dark skin tone who are garishly dressed.
They're savages, yeah.
Yes, what one might well call sort of savages makeup on.
Yeah.
And the impression is given through some fairly basic effects that they are attacking the ship. Now, in America, with all that has been discussed, about race, I am amazed that you can get a ride in which caricatured African natives are portrayed as savages to be evaded.
Yeah.
Maybe you can tell me how Disney justify that. Maybe you can tell me Disney aren't worried about it because no one else is worried about it. But for me, that a celebration of colonialism is pretty dark.
Yeah.
Wait, isn't Tarzan is it Disney?
Yes, Tarzan is Disney.
Yeah. Yeah, that ride is shocking. I don't know. It seems so, like you're saying, anachronistic. It seems like a throwback. I mean, with Pirates, as you know, the alterations over time, I mean, part of that was branding to bring in the Johnny Depp, Jack Sparrow character. But, the scene with the winches and where, it's presuming or intuiting that, this woman will be sexually assaulted or something by this man. Over time, they changed that, right?
Yeah.
And some people actually thought, oh, no, you shouldn't do this because this is the traditional ride. With the Jungle Cruise, I don't know how that still exists. I don't know why that hasn't been changed, because it does seem...
What hasn't been campaigned against?
Yeah, but that itself is shocking to me because it just seems so offensive. I mean, I've seen similar things. I remember years ago I was at Dollywood in Tennessee, and I saw a lot of minstrelsy stuff in the gift shop, blackface figurines you could buy, and I found that shocking. This was in the 90s visiting there. So you still see some of this, and again, for all the pluralistic stuff and the multiculturalism, we elected a president who has called neo-Nazis and white supremacists good people. So I would say, if you look into the racial history and just all the prejudice and stereotyping that's part of American society to this day, if you saw Spike Lee's new film, which has been controversial, but I thought was an interesting look filmically at Birth of a Nation and some historical trajectories there, I think, that's probably a reflection of who we are in some ways still. Unfortunately.
Europa Park.
Yeah.
In Germany, you put up a slide of, I forget what it's called, but it effectively, I think it translates as the African River Ride.
Yeah.
that also has highly caricatured, static mannequins of
really offensive,
savages. With no, although it is the African River Ride, no attempt whatsoever is made to suggest that Africa has any different parts or different areas, or that maybe different parts of Africa vary. And that's in Germany. And then in the Netherlands, at the large theme park in the Netherlands, Efteling.
Efteling.
You have a ride in which there is again a stereotyped cannibal, dark skin, exaggerated facial features of sort of flattened nose, who is holding a white explorer in his hand, and it's a very simple teacups ride, but the teacups are cooking pots, and you are trying to escape, and it's called Monsieur Cannibal. There's a song played in French, and we're in the Netherlands, but a lot of people speak French. And I actually got up to the point of getting the words up because I thought I'm misinterpreting this. The story goes, and this plays in a loop, and it's a very jolly song whilst the ride spins, that there is an explorer in Africa, undefined, trying to catch butterflies, and he is captured by an African chief, and he shows the African chief various signs of civilization, a lighter and so forth. He tries to offer them, but the African chief is determined to eat him. And then finally, out from the explorer's pocket falls what are known as sort of Paris postcards, which are effectively soft-core pornography of the type of the 19th century. And translated, it's full of naked women. These are remplis de filles tout nues. And suddenly, the cannibal understands and places the explorer in his harem.
So it's totally heteronormative.
It's quite a short song, but they get a lot of story in. And the refrain of the song is repeatedly, Mr. Cannibal, please let me go, Mr. Cannibal, please don't eat me. And then at the end, the final refrain, the cannibal comes along and says, you can go, and the refrain is changed to, Monsieur Cannibal, I'd rather die than leave your harem. So, offence to be taken on so many levels. And yet, the Netherlands, a very tolerant country. I'm informed that there has been some newspaper criticism of it, but when I went last year, it was very much still there, and people were still in the cooking pots, and the song was still playing.
Well, and that's the thing. There are opportunities, like whether you're studying theme parks or these attractions of any sort, to do studies of race, to do studies of gender, to do studies of consumption. That's what makes theme parks. The whole literature on Ren Hai's work on Chinese ethnic theme parks and the construction of ethnic minority imaginaries via Chinese society. I mean, so many great opportunities to study, and sometimes we see the extremes, and I think maybe we have an advantage. I mean, they're horrific and offensive, but then we can really see very quickly, kind of like that architect's version of Iceland, right? The quick version of a racial imaginary. So again, I want to think that American society is not the Jungle Cruise, but I see Trump and I say, we're the Jungle Cruise. We pretty much are. I mean, I hate to say that, but we forget, and that's a reminder of really who we are, unfortunately.
I want to talk more to you about post-coloniality in the theme parks. I think there is...
Oh, such a great,
I think there is some work we could possibly
Well, I guess we should maybe stop.
Yes.
Okay, let's